The entire history of armored warfare is marked by the struggle between offense and defense. Tank developers were always trying to create vehicles that were as well protected as possible, while building means with which to defeat the competition that was attempting to do the same thing. The first tanks were rather rudimentary, boxes of iron and steel designed to fight enemy infantry rather than each other. Their guns firing simple explosive rounds or even solid steel shots. It was only 2 decades later, during the Spanish Civil War, when the importance of tank versus tank combat was really demonstrated, and the race to create the best weapon and the best armor started in earnest. Soon, new types of guns and ammunition were developed, and the Leviathans of old made way for sleek war machines with sloped armor. But at the end of the war, the armor was still mostly made of steel. Even with the greatest conflict of human history over, the race never stopped, and it continues to this day. Steel was replaced by aluminum and alloys, and soon after, composite armor was born to defeat the latest types of shells and missiles. We are going to find out exactly how this evolution is represented in armored warfare.
Armored warfare features armored fighting vehicles dating all the way back to post-World War II, up to the modern-day vehicles that you'll see around the world today. So it does feature vehicles from the Korean War era, the Cold War era, as well as more recent conflicts that have happened in the last couple of decades. One of the things that we really wanted to represent in armored warfare was the way that technology has evolved in armored conflict. So there was this back and forth race to evolve ammunition to be better at penetrating different types of armor. And then armor evolved to defend against different types of ammunition. And that back and forth cycle has really gone on ever since armored fighting vehicles were invented. And then we want to reflect that in the game. And so we have the different types of ammunition that have been invented, represented, available for the different vehicles that were able to use it. So the three primary types of ammunition out there that can be broken down into is the armor penetrating shells, or kinetic penetrators, shape charges, also referred to quite often as heat, and the high explosive shells, which are often abbreviated as HE. Each one of these different shells has a different strength and weakness, and we wanted to represent that in the game.
So each one of these is going to be useful in a particular situation and will be better or worse against different kinds of armor. So what armor or what ammunition a player chooses to use is going to be highly dependent on the situation. Armor penetrating rounds, the kinetic penetrators, these are basically just big metal arrows. And the idea is that these things travel extremely quickly, and all of their penetration potential comes from mass of the projectile and the velocity of the projectile.
So for example, the armor-piercing shells have very high precision penetration factor against almost all types of armor, but they're not going to do the highest level of potential damage. Heat shells, on the other hand, have very high penetration against most types of armor, but there's also way more countermeasures available against that type of shell, which we'll talk about further on. Probably a good way to compare some of the broad categories of ammunition is if you think about the high-precision sniper rifle rounds from, say, a Barrett 50 caliber. In that case, your shell is going to have a very high muzzle velocity, and it's going to have very high, precise precision penetration at the point of impact. So that has the advantages of very short travel time, making it easier to hit a moving target, as well as having very little that can defend against it because it's just a straight shot that's going to penetrate. The high explosive shells are really good at splash damage, dealing damage over a radius rather than having to hit their targets directly, but they also suffer the lowest penetration, so very thick armor defends quite well against high explosives.
It's the only type of ammunition that can deal an indirect hit to a vehicle, so even if you miss the target, the area of effect may be large enough to deal some damage, and it's also very useful against targets that are very lightly armored. If you can penetrate a target and get your ammunition inside their vehicle, it'll create an explosion inside their vehicle and deal devastating damage to the target.
On the other hand, you have probably something closer to, like maybe a grenade launcher would be a little bit closer to a high explosive shell. So you have slower travel time, you're going to lob that shot over a distance, and then it's going to explode at the point of impact. So the disadvantage there is of course, you have the slower shell velocity, so a little bit harder to hit a moving target. But you have the advantage of that splash at the end of the impact, so it can actually hit in a wider radius and hit something that maybe you didn't hit quite directly.
Shape charge ammunition is a little bit different from AP. The idea is that the projectile itself isn't actually doing the penetration. When it hits armor or something on the path, it actually detonates and creates a stream of metal particles that are sent into the armor to do the penetration in real life. In Armored Warfare, the way that we simulate that is that the projectile doesn't lose any penetration potential with distance. So until it hits something, it has all of its penetration potential. Once the projectile hits something, at that point, then the stream is created, and we do a ray trace into the vehicle. And the further the distance that the stream has to travel to hit the base armor, the more penetration potential it loses on the way. So the idea is that even though it doesn't have as high of a penetration potential as a kinetic penetrator, it also has no loss of penetration at distance, and it's very, very damaging once it actually manages to get inside of a vehicle. So compared to a normal AP round, the shape charge rounds are going to deal a lot more damage when they actually manage to penetrate. In addition to that, most of the ATGMs that we have in the game, which are the guided missiles, are using the shape charge hit resolution model.
Anti-tank guided missiles use a shaped charge, so they fall into the same category as high explosive anti-tank ammunition, at least typically. The special thing with missiles is that you can manually guide them using your mouse. So even after you've fired it, if your target is moving or that sort of thing, you can try to move your missile in order to follow the target and hit them in a weak spot. You can also do some trick shots with that, like trying to guide your missile around a corner or sending it up into the air and then back down to hit a very unarmored part of the top of a vehicle. There are also things called thermobaric anti-tank guided missiles, which are very special rounds that function like high explosive rounds. You still guide them with your mouse, just like other missiles, but they explode in an area of effect similar to high explosive rounds.
They require a little bit more skill than maybe that seems like, because they move a lot slower than the regular projectiles do. So it takes a while for them to get to their target, and they also are not going to be extremely maneuverable. So if an enemy vehicle manages to get into cover, or if they're very quick, it's going to be hard to hit them with one of those guided missiles. That is a major disadvantage of using ATGMs. Even though they are going to be extremely powerful, you're exposed the whole time that thing is in the air. Now, you could try to drive and guide it at the same time, but I think that what most players are going to find is that's almost impossible.
As you can see, the commander of any vehicle in Armored Warfare has a fearsome arsenal at his disposal. But there are ways to mitigate the impact of some shells with armor and additional equipment. We will talk about that in the next part of our Developer Diary. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned.